Prime Minister, ministers, ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to welcome you to the OECD's 2017 Ministerial Council meeting on making globalization work, better lives for all. Now, we're honored to be joined by Prime Minister Luca Rasmussen, Denmark, our Ministerial Council meeting chair. Together with our vice chairs, Australia, the United Kingdom, and the chair, the Danish government, has helped define an ambitious, forward-looking agenda around the most pressing issues of the world, the most pressing of the global challenges. Our focus on making globalization work for all is a timely one. Globalization has advanced rapidly over the past decades and brought about many benefits. It has facilitated global economic growth, integrated emerging economies in global markets, lifted millions out of poverty, and spread technology, citizens, and cultures across the world. Yet, in many OECD countries, citizens are turning their backs on globalization. Populist voices calling for protectionism and what we call exclusive nationalism are attracting support in public opinions and making progress in elections. This is in part fueled by a widespread belief that the benefits of globalization have been concentrated in the hands of a few. And we have to begin by acknowledging that many have indeed been left behind. In some OECD countries, real median incomes have not grown in the last 20 years. Meanwhile, the richest 10% of the population now earn almost 10 times more than the poorest 10%, up from 7 times in the 80s, only a generation ago. And wealth is even more concentrated than income. At the last count, the 1% of the wealthiest households in the OECD held about 18% of household wealth, while the bottom 40% owned only a few percentage points. And these inequalities are not only growing. The problem is that they're becoming increasingly entrenched. And, perhaps worse, they are being inherited. It has become an intergenerational issue. The role of globalization is driving these disparities. And how it is driving these disparities, in where and in what areas it is driving these disparities, is complex. What we cannot do is say globalization is responsible for all these problems, because we would, of course, be, as they say, throwing out the baby with the bathwater. Huh? Now, we don't have all the answers. There are many factors at play, but there are some plausible mechanisms of how we can expect or how we can explain how it is that this has happened, how this got wrong. For example, in the few past decades, tax systems in the OECD have tended to shift the tax burden onto labor and become less progressive. Of course, this was done because you wanted to promote investment, or you wanted to promote, the deployment of capital, et cetera, et cetera. But effectively, we have in many of our own countries here in the OECD upwards of 50% of what we call a tax wedge, which is how much of the income of the workers is taken off by taxes. Of course, globalization has also facilitated tax evasion and tax avoidance, something in which we are embarked together with all of you in this fight against tax avoidance and evasion. There's also this phenomenon of financialization. There's a deepening financialization of our economies. And of course, that is positive. Arun Jaitley, the finance minister of India here, in this extraordinary effort of actually giving IDs to more than 1 billion citizens in India, and in the process creating about 300,000 bank accounts in India. The question of the services, of financial services, it just made a lot of progress. But at the same time, it also has contributed to exacerbate some of the inequalities because the people that have higher incomes are more closely associated to the revenues, to the instruments, to the products that deal with the exacerbation of and the polarization of inequality. There's also a phenomenon that is not always obvious, and that is we have identified for a long time now that in the process of trying to promote productivity, that there's the dominance of leading firms in some sectors has become very important. And typically, you know, when you're looking at the digital market, one understands better the kind of the winner-take-all type of logic. But the question is also that there's a growing gap between those cutting-edge companies and the rest of the companies in the economy. And the employees of those companies move exactly along the same lines. The skills, the wages follow the same pattern. Therefore, that progress, which in itself is positive, is also creating or exacerbating some of the inequalities that we have seen in the labor market. And of course, the combination of technological change and globalization, the digital economy, has made many people feel that they're threatened, that their jobs are at risk when they involve routine tasks. And of course, that contributes also to the polarization of labor markets. So, where do we go from here? How do we plot a path to a better quality of globalization? Well, we clearly must not risk a retreat from global openness and growing integration. We need new approaches based around inclusive growth and by putting well-being at the front and center of the policy objectives. The OECD's new approaches to economic challenges, so-called NAEC initiative, has been questioning assumptions, questioning models, promoting new policy tools, promoting new data. It's almost 5 years now. We need to continue deepening and spreading these insights, fostering what we call a NAEC state of mind, a NAEC way of life across our member and partner countries, but also among our staff. It's about empowering people with the skills to pursue opportunity in a globalized and increasingly digitalized economy. It's about developing, creating solutions to ensure universal care to quality, universal access to quality health care, universal access to quality education, and also to promote the integration of migrants. A very important new challenge, not because it wasn't always there, but because of the force, the numbers with which it has presented itself. It's also about supporting SMEs, which are the essence, the backbone, the blood of our economies, and they are the ones who create the new jobs. It's about strengthening technological diffusion. It's about improving social protection and safety nets, but without creating disincentives to increased innovation and productivity. It's also, Prime Minister, dear friends, about strengthening international standards, about making them more effective when leveling the playing field, and when improving inclusiveness. In particular, we need greater international collaboration on competition, on taxation, on state-owned enterprises, on responsible business conduct, on fighting corruption, and of course, on trade and climate issues. While in some cases new standards may be needed, in others it is a question of broadening the coverage of existing standards. It is a question of enforcing their compliance. The OECD is already working across these areas to improve the governance of globalization. But of course, we need to increase this effort. We'll be going deep into all these issues over the course of this MCM. There will be sessions dedicated to making globalization more inclusive, more able to support people, firms, regions, and cities in an open and digitalized economy, more open to competition and more able to spread the benefits of trade and investment to all, or at least to a larger number than has been the case so far. The OECD will be supporting these discussions with a number of important OECD deliverables to feed your creativity and to feed your level of ambition. Now, in addition to the key issues paper, and here is the key issues paper that you will all be working with and working on. There's also the question of the business and finance that we recently put out, and I'm very happy to say it has become a bit of a bestseller since it was put out only a few days ago. Business and Finance Outlook, to take a look at what's going on in the financial world. Then we're also going to be looking at the next production revolution, implication for governments and business. Let me say, by the way, in the presence of Prime Minister Rasmussen, that of course he just created in Denmark the Council on Disruption, or the Disruption Council. I don't want to call it the Disruptive Council, no, it's the Council on Disruption, precisely to deal with the question of how does one deal with the progress on digital, the progress on technology, the progress on computers, the progress on la numérique, and how to make it work for all. And we have engaged since our visit in Copenhagen, and even today he's coming back to have a hard-working session in the afternoon to be able to work on that. Then investing in climate, investing in growth. This is a very clear message that protecting the climate can be a good business, that you can have investments, that you can create jobs, and that you can create technological progress, and therefore that the first movers will have an advantage in terms of being able to spread out the technology. And we have, of course, a little later today, Catherine Mann, our chief economist, will put out the economic outlook. And we have been working and mentioning inclusive growth so many times. This is the report about an update on the inclusive growth work that has been undertaken throughout the OECD. And then last but not least, because it's not yet out, on the 13th of June, we will present the employment outlook. So you can see we're touching on a number of the elements that define globalization and that are seeking to not only have a diagnosis, but also to have a better, what I would call a better set of policy recommendations for our member countries. Now, so let me tell you also the fact that we have Denmark as a chair. I like to just underline the fact that it's a very happy occasion. It's a very happy, I don't want to call it a coincidence because maybe, things happen for a reason. That at this critical ministerial meeting, we have as a chair this open economy that has set an example in so many ways, precisely in terms of getting those balances right, of getting globalization right. It is an honor to welcome Prime Minister Rasmussen to launch this Ministerial Council meeting. You have been a promoter of market openness and integration while empowering citizens with a robust safety net, and also with the education and the skills, the portability of the skills, the mobility that we are seeing today is lacking precisely to make globalization work. You have provided your citizens with that mobility, this portability. Denmark is a country that is also experiencing the difficult challenges of migration in Europe. But of course, here is another experience that Denmark can share with us. So, also I mentioned a moment ago about this disruption council, which just shows the fact that when you have to call everybody in society to deal with a new issue like the digital, it shows a complexity, but also it shows that everybody should be involved in terms of how you're going to deal with this in the future. It's not just a government responsibility, it's not just one government decision, but it is a decision that will have to be taken by government after thorough consultation. So let me pass the floor to Prime Minister Rasmussen, chair of this 2017 MCM, with a quote from his New Year's wishes to the Danish people. He said, "We cannot build walls against the world. If we do, we will end up locking ourselves in." So these inspiring words capture why we are here today. Premier, you have the floor, please.
Thank you so much, Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It is indeed an honor for me to stand here today in the heart of Europe, in the halls of the OECD. I need not tell you that the world situation is very serious. That must be apparent to all intelligent people. Those iconic words were expressed 70 years and 2 days ago in the halls of Harvard University in a famous speech by late Secretary of State George C. Marshall. On the day of the speech, the crowd in Harvard Yard did not expect to see history being made, but they did. They witnessed a giant leap for the reconstruction of Europe, the vision of what would become the Marshall Plan. Today, the people of Europe owe much of their progress to this great plan and to this great man. The core of the plan was to help Europe resurrect from the ashes of war and encourage our continent to cooperate instead of fighting. It was in this spirit that OECD was formed under the name of OEED. And ever since, the OECD has played a key role in promoting peace and prosperity through economic cooperation. Today, the world economy is more interlinked than ever. Globalization is at its peak, and in my mind, the overall benefits cannot be overstated. Let me give just a couple of examples. Since 1990, infant mortality has been reduced by more than 40% worldwide. The number of people living in extreme poverty has been reduced by more than 1 billion people. Life expectancy is growing. The level of literacy has never been higher. More people than ever have access to electricity. So, in short, globalization drives a staggering technological development, a wider market access, and better living conditions for the vast majority of the global population. For a vast majority, yes, but not for all. Because as globalization is increasing, the gap between the fortunate and less fortunate seems to widen. Last summer, I was personally reminded about that at two separate occasions. The first one took place in my own living room, in my own apartment. My oldest son, Bergur, has just graduated from Copenhagen Business School with a degree in international business. And to celebrate, he invited some of his fellow students, many of them from abroad, for a dinner in our apartment. And I was appointed chef of the evening. While I was cooking and serving food for those youngsters, I couldn't help noticing their optimism. None of them feared the future. They were full of dreams and ambitions. And some few days later, I was biking with a group of kids who are a part of my foundation established to help boys on the edge of society. Boys between 16 to 20 who have suffered many defeats in life and in school, now left with nowhere to go. They were talking about the future as well, as we were biking. One hoped for an apprenticeship, another has just received his first good grade ever. And these boys had dreams as well. But their dreams far too often turn into dead ends because of lacking qualifications. And this experience with two groups of youngsters in my own country reminded me that the last group is in serious risk of being lost, now more perhaps than ever, because there's almost no jobs left for people who can't read an instruction manual or calculate a percentage. And that is the flip side of globalization. And if we want globalization to progress, we cannot neglect this issue anymore. We cannot neglect that many people feel worse off as a result of global dynamics. We cannot neglect that to millions of people, globalization equals job insecurity. And we cannot neglect that these people will not buy in on globalization if they feel the price is too high. So the good question is, how do we respond? It is a question that holds many answers and no simple solutions. But to me, the basic answer was given 70 years ago by George Marshall. We need to take concrete action, make sure no one is left behind. And to me, there are at least three important things we can do, three important things we need to do. First of all, we have to realize that the challenges of globalization also need a national response. Not in a sense of increased protectionism or self-sufficiency, but by making the reforms needed to handle the shifting demands. Initiatives that ensure job creation instead of job preservation. And this is not easy. It takes courage, but there is no way around it. To me, job creation is by far the most effective answer to those who fear globalization. And this brings me to my second point. Our society, labor markets, and companies need to adapt to future demands. The best way is to provide people with the skills needed to get a new job when the old one disappears. Therefore, we need to provide lifelong education at all levels to all people in our societies. And right now, I'm most concerned about those who have least possibilities. Therefore, my government has recently proposed a combined set of initiatives targeting the group of pupils who do worst in school. Because those kids are the ones in serious risk of being left behind in the long run. And if they do, they will be among those who pledge for more walls against globalization. Instead of walls, we need to give them a bridge to the future. That's where social security comes in. Denmark has, as you might know, a high degree of social security, financed by high taxes. This provides us with both advantages and disadvantages. But one of the great advantages is that it supports a flexible labor market. For instance, companies in Denmark can easily hire and fire workers. This allows employers to quickly change and reallocate resources, and it is accepted because it comes with a fair degree of security. This is the approach which is often referred to as flexicurity. And of course, each country has to find its own way of doing things. But I'm sure of this. If we do not care about those who are in risk of losing from globalization, then no one will truly win in the long run. And this brings me to my third and last point. We need to ensure further cooperation. We need more, not fewer, international trade agreements which provide a level playing field, and they should include provisions of labor, social and environmental issues. We need to increase cooperation on issues of market distorting behavior, tax avoidance, and irresponsible business conduct. We need a solid international response to climate change, to poverty reduction, security, and migration, across nations, across continents, across beliefs. But we also need to increase cooperation on a local level, on a national level. And there are many ways to do this. This spring, as it was mentioned by the Secretary General, I have put together a national Danish partnership called the Disruption Council. It consists of both labor unions, employer associations, entrepreneurs, CEOs, and ministers. And the point is to look at the challenges and possibilities together, and especially to make the unions and the employers join forces. Because at the end of the day, they are in the same boat, on the same ocean, facing the same winds of change and the occasional hurricanes. Luckily, we already have a long tradition of such cooperation on labor market issues in Denmark. And as a consequence, Danish employers and labor unions are used to taking responsibility, to cooperate, and perhaps most importantly, to be constructive, find solutions. This has proven to be a great value, not at least to the ones in danger of losing their jobs because of globalization. The OECD is, in my view, uniquely placed to facilitate the search for answers in this very complex debate on globalization. With its fact-based approach and vast knowledge base, the OECD can inspire member countries and international organizations as we debate the challenges and opportunities of globalization. So, ladies and gentlemen, when George Marshall held his famous speech, he brought new hope to a Europe at its knees after the war. And he did so because he took action, took care of people who needed it. Today, we need to do the same. Hope is not enough. Action is required. I need not tell you, the situation is challenging. The people of the world are looking at us, their representatives, for solutions, and we cannot look the other way. If we do not close the gap between the fortunate kids at my dinner table and those less fortunate kids on their bikes who could barely keep up, we will all end up losing. There are no easy solutions here, but there are solutions at hand. So let's join forces and make globalization work for all people. Let us be as visionary as George Marshall was. Thank you very much.
Our thanks to Prime Minister Rasmussen and the Secretary-General. If you could please remain in your seats while the Prime Minister and the Secretary-General leave the auditorium. The presentation of the economic outlook with the Secretary-General and Chief Economist Catherine Mann will begin shortly. If you could stay in your seats, though, for the